So I think we're now good with recording this session. And what I had planned for today is that we're actually going to jump right into the first chapter. But before we do, I do want to say a massive thank you for your great work. I have really appreciated everything you've done. And that really is all about getting you set up for this course. So this is the first chapter of the actual lecture material that we're going to tackle. And in addition to that, we'll be completing first proper lab this week. It's going to be more of a, because of being in an online setting, it's going to be more of a theoretical one, but it's going to be a good way to see why it is important that we do certain very basic things, but basic things that have huge value, such as hand washing. But like I said, if at any stage you have a question, just unmute yourself and shout out. I'll try to monitor the chat as well, but when I go from one screen to another, I do lose that visibility. So if you don't get your answer there, do also just give me a holla that you've got a question there. But what I was hoping for us to look today was to do about a very basic thing, and starting with the basic point that our course is titled as biology. And your textbook, which I have a picture there as well, is titled as biology. And we should really figure out, what is biology then? Why are we studying this? Why are you here? And one of the definitions that we get for biology is that it's a scientific study of life. And there's two important points there. First of all, the fact that it is focusing on life and studying life. And so we're all about living things. We're not going to be studying in biology things that don't classify as living things. And there are few things that are kind of weird, that they're not quite non-living, but they're not quite living either. And those are some of the exceptions that we'll have a look more of on the BIO182, but our bio course focuses on the living things. The second point that's going to be important is that biology is definitely a science. So you are taking a class in the science division. So we're going to approach life following all those conventions and practices that make good science. So those are the two key terms that we built this course around. And one thing that I find interesting is that when we look at the Earth, and when we think of the Earth, even from a great distance, we can see many things that suggests us that there's a life happening there. So what I was going to ask from you at this point is that, if you don't mind, kind of as an activity that allows me to take an attendance, if you could post something on the chat that makes you think, when you look at the Earth from a distance, that there's life there. And if you feel that you have nothing to say at all, then just post your name. But let's try, if there are things that make you think that there's something that's alive on the Earth, from this picture that we have on the upper right corner. What on that picture makes you think that there's life on the Earth? So I'm going to try to get to the chat so I see the answers. Perfect. I see a lot of good answers coming through. Excellent. So I see that people are sharing that all the green things, absolutely. So that's signs that there's some sort of photosynthesis going on. The land, yes, a lot of the life currently exists on land, such as our life form. Water, very well spotted. Water, again, is essential for life. Pretty much all of the living things are largely made of water and require water to live. Plants, like was shared there, I also saw that green signaling or indicating that it's about growth. That was very good. Excellent job there. So very good observations. So life can be seen in so many different scales. I guess that's what I really want to take away from this. And when we compare the Earth to the moon that we have a picture on the left bottom corner, the difference is drastic. So we could see signs of life, whether it was the presence of water, the seas, the forests, mountains, the different shapes of the land masses, even within the water, forming different kinds of ecosystems for life to exist. On the moon, we don't see life. What's bizarre to me is that we have actually mapped the entire surface of the moon already quite a while ago, whereas we still have no idea of all the seas on the Earth. So we still haven't mapped all of those, but yet we have done that for the moon's surface. So we have a lot to learn even on our own planet without going any further. I do have to give a shout out at this point. University of Arizona has done an amazing job, especially on the mapping of the moon's surface. Actually, in fact, when NASA was planning to do the first lunar landings, they turned to the U of A for their maps, because the mapping that U of A had conducted of the surface of the moon was so complete. So we have a lot to be proud here. The other thing that I think that is important to remember is that biology can be defined much more broadly than just as the scientific study of life. In addition to that, biology looks at all of those interactions of different forms of life that exist. So we have the general life, but then all of these life forms interact with each other as well. So that's another thing that we look with biology. How do one animal affect another animal? Or, for example, an animal affect a plant, and so on. So we end up with these complex interactions with all forms of life. There's really, I struggle to think of any form of life that wouldn't have any kind of interaction with other living things. And that's not all that we do in biology. In addition to that, we have a look of these interactions of life forms also with the general environment where they're at. This includes also the non-living environment. So we're not only looking at the living things, we're also looking at the things that are non-living. So there's a lot that biology covers, and that's why really the field of biology is so extremely broad. And that's why, for the purposes of this course as well, we need to keep it fairly narrowed, that what of all of these options we are going to be focusing on. So our course is all about looking at the very basics that are going to be needed as a foundation for you to move onwards with the study of especially health-related, allied health-related sciences. But then on BIO182, we explore the biology and different forms of life and different groupings of life in a broader scale. I have on this slide kind of two extremes that I wanted to include on purpose. So I have this picture of the Earth, and we can study life on this large scale, looking at the Earth as a system and systems biology, how different things within that whole system work together and affect each other. But we can also study biology in very, very tiny scale, as we can see here, where we have picture of E. coli bacteria. So that's just a bacteria that I picked, but it shows how small we can go also in the study of life. So really, that scale can be anything you want, but we're seeing all of these three things, regardless on what scale we're studying life, whether it is on a microscopic scale or a global scale. In terms of the E. coli, I kind of wanted to bring it up at this point, tying a little bit to what we talked about last week about the lab safety and importance of that. And especially when this book came out that we're using, there was a lot of in the news about E. coli. So what does E. coli do? Well, E. coli is naturally present in our digestive system, and E. coli plays role, for example, in vitamin K synthesis, and it is an important part of normal healthy flora within the digestive tract. However, we also have disease outbreaks when E. coli is found where it shouldn't be found. And if I'm really gonna be gruesome and say what E. coli gives you, it gives you the poops. So that we will be using actually E. coli in some of our labs because it has so many things that make it a good model organism. It's a great way of testing out things. It's very small, it's very easy to grow, and it grows fast. So we use that. But because E. coli can make you very sick, we want to be certain that whenever we use these, we use proper lab safety practices. So that's why this course started with that. And before we look into any other labs, it was very important that we have appreciation of the importance of safe lab practices. And really on this week's lab, we'll then take that and take it a step further and start talking about why hand washing is so important in healthcare field. So like I said, E. coli is largely used as a model organism, but it doesn't mean that it would be always safe. It doesn't mean that it would be always dangerous. It's all about what you do with it. And that really applies to what I believe in all of our study. Whenever you learn more, you also get a little bit more responsibility. You can do a lot of good and you can do a lot of bad, more knowledge you have. So I try to emphasize to my students that, well, now that you have this knowledge, be wise with how you use it. Well, I'm going to jump back here to our discussion about the biology. Unless we have any questions about kind of where we ventured off, I do like to have a little bit of story strands for topics that we talk about. And those strands do carry a meaningful message, but I also try to make sure that we get the big pictures. But if there's any questions, again, I'm just jumping in and out of the screen so I can see if any questions come up, but also don't hesitate to unmute and give me a shout out. The other thing that I wanted to speak about, since we are studying life, is in terms of the life and where life started. Many of you mentioned the oceans, the water, even the clouds that we can see. So all life, as we know at the moment, started in water as these microorganisms. So these were about 3.8 billion years ago. And that's a really long time ago, but it also took a long time before these microorganisms evolved into anything else than these tiny microorganisms that were floating around in the water. And these were prokaryotes. So prokaryotes are single-celled organisms, such as bacteria, such as the E. coli. And throughout this course, we will talk more about prokaryotes and compare them to eukaryotes. So you don't need to know the difference now, but just know that they were very, very simple kind of cell-like structures. And only fairly recently, we ended up seeing plants and animals. It's been about 100 to 200 million years ago. So if you compare that clock where 12 hours would be the entire length of the time that we have had life on the earth, it's really a short period of time that we have had plants and animals on earth. And if we use that same scale, we notice that humans have existed only for a really, really short drop of a time. About 2.5 million years ago, we have first signs of humans appearing. So Earth is really unique out of all the planets in our solar system because it is the only one that, as far as we know, is capable of maintaining life. But of course, we're constantly looking around and trying to find evidence if there could be life or if there could be evidence that life has existed or that life could exist somewhere else on our solar system or on the space at large. And really, when we go to the space, that's why we look for signs of water, because as far as we know, life is not going to exist without water. So that brings us to our quiz's first question that we were looking this week. And again, I would appreciate if you're willing to take part on the chat and just shout out your choice of an answer. So I'm asking on that question that what biology is. Is it A, scientific study of life? B, does it study the interactions of different forms of life? C, does it study organisms' interactions with environment? Or D, none of the above? So let's see what you have ended up picking. I see great job there. You are correct. It studies life. I see Fu caught the trick that I have put in there. So well done, Zachary, Erica, and also I think we had early on Andrew who picked it up. Now others are. So it's all those three. So biology studies all of those three things. So we're looking scientific study of life, but we're also looking at the interactions of different forms of life, and we're also having a look of those interactions with the environment, both living and non-living environment. So there's a lot that biology really allows us to explore. And then I included that little short introduction to E. coli. So again, on the same model, if you don't mind, give me a shout out there on the chat that which of these statements or which statement or which of the statements are true. Do we find E. coli A naturally? Is it a bacteria that's naturally found in the intestines and helps with absorption of vitamin K? Is it that E. coli has also these virulent strains that cause diseases, for example, when food gets contaminated? Could it be that C, E. coli is a great model organism because it's quick, easy, and cheap to grow up in large numbers? Will we, D, use E. coli in this class? Or E, none of the statements above are correct? So I see answers coming through, and you've totally caught the way I have formulated. So there's multiple correct answers. So thank you again for everyone who answered. Like I said, I take notes of those, and it definitely counts as a positive that you've been participating actively. So yes, E. coli is all of the statements that I had listed there, and more. So we talked, and so far we have gotten to kind of consensus that biology was all about the scientific study of life. And I want to focus on the scientific aspect in the next part of our review of the material. But before I get any further, I just wanted to check, do we have any questions? Again, remember, you're always free to just shout out, but I try to also check, so you can just unmute or you can type on the chat. But again, if I don't hear anything, I'm just going to carry on and you'll just let me know. So let's have a look of this aspect that biology was the scientific study of life. So that brings us to discuss about science. And I'm very lucky. I consider myself lucky that when I was younger, I was made to study Latin, and not just Latin cultures, but actually Latin language. So the old Latin. And word science comes from Latin word scientia, which stands for word knowledge. So science is all about building knowledge. So when you are doing science, your ultimate goal really is to end up developing new knowledge or filling in gaps in the already existing knowledge, or do something that adds to that knowledge that we have. So science is all about knowledge. And of course, science then can be divided into many different fields. In science, we do have general laws, such as you can think of, for example, Newton's laws in physics. And we have also general principles in terms of you can think of, for example, Pythagoras, the calculus and math principles that we use to do mathematical sciences. So science can be approached in quite a few different ways, and this is one way of looking at science. But what really unifies sciences is that to do science and come up with this knowledge, this new knowledge, and develop this knowledge further, we use a systematic method. And that method is known as a scientific method. So it's the method that we use to do good science. And scientific method is actually fairly structured. It's really following a certain pattern, and it doesn't allow a lot of deviation from the correct method of doing sciences. And the correct method of doing sciences exists because this method allows us to make sure that we are producing high quality knowledge and that knowledge is accurate. We're trying to eliminate any errors, any misunderstandings from that knowledge. So we're going to be talking about the scientific method towards the end of this session, step by step, by using an example. And it's going to be important that you're comfortable with how scientific method works. But before we go there, I want to take one step away and divide different fields of sciences into two bigger groups. So we have our natural sciences, and natural sciences are all about to do with the physical world around us, things that happen in it. So these are often known as our hard sciences, if you wish. So that includes our biology that we'll be looking at. Then we have also social sciences, and social sciences focus more on the human behaviors and behavioral sciences. So these are sometimes known as softer sciences. And we're leaving the field of social sciences for the division of social sciences, and there's a lot that is covered under that umbrella as well. And on this course, we're going to be focusing on the natural sciences. And let's look at natural sciences a little more. So natural sciences can be then divided into two different groups. We can talk about physical sciences. So physical sciences look at non-living things, such as chemistry and physics and so on. And then we have our life sciences. And that, of course, covers or is all about the biology. So that's going to be our focus on this course. But it's good to know where we fit in terms of the different fields of science and approaches to science. Then there are occasionally, and this is just kind of like good to know kind of a thing, there are fields that overlap the two. For example, biochemistry is a combination of both life and physical sciences. So even though we do these divisions, sometimes they're a little artificial and sometimes they can be bent. So at this point again, I just wanted to check that, does that make sense, everything that we've talked about? And do remember that we do have a little more complete set of lecture videos available that I've also provided on this week's module. These weekly sessions are really like pulling the most important things out of those lecture videos and also helping you to tackle the homework aspects. So if biology was all about a scientific study of life and the science was of this building up knowledge, I gave myself a little bit of a challenge and listed as many examples of different subfields of biology that I could. And I'm sure that there's some that I have overlooked, but even this list that I've provided here, this short list, gives you an idea that biology is incredibly varied field. There's a lot that can be covered there, and there's a lot of topics. And many of us end up specializing on one or another subfield, but it still means that we all share the basic understanding of the biology and basic understanding and agreement of how biology is studied, the rules of biological sciences, and so on. So even though we have these subfields, we all still kind of come from the same place. But I do also want to show how incredibly varied it is. If you don't know yet what you're passionate about in the field of biology, do not worry. There's plenty of time to choose, and there's plenty to choose from. Well, that brings us to the next question that I have for this quiz. And this is going to be a little bit of a trickier one to answer in the chat. But I have there 4 terms and 4 definitions. And I think we should start with the term biology. So what of these 4 would you think that describes biology properly? Is it related to the human behavior? Is it scientific study of life? Is it systematic process of building up knowledge? Or is it related to the physical world? And there is one answer that is a better match than the others. And I think I see perfect job there. It is definitely all about the scientific study of life. So then we get to the term science. What would science be out of these 3 that we have left? Is science best described as being related to human behavior or systematic process of building up knowledge, or related to the physical world? And I see excellent job there. So it is definitely about the process of building up knowledge, and we do that process in a systematic manner. So those would be 2 good definitions to know for the homework. And then we have the difference between natural sciences and social sciences, and we just touched upon that. So what would we say about natural sciences? Perfect. I see answers coming through. It is related to the physical world. Perfect job there. So that leaves us that social sciences would be all about the human behavior. Excellent job. I'm very, very impressed. Really, terminology matters, and those are some that would be very good questions both in this week's chapter quiz, but also when we get to the exam. So definitions are worth of always checking out. So I'm very, very proud of you guys. Thank you for taking part, and you clearly have these drafts really well. Well, that takes us to the next topic that I wanted to talk. And this might seem a little theoretical, but bear with me. I think the best way to tackle this is through examples. And there's two ways of approaching reasoning process. How we make decisions, how we make sense of the world, how we figure out things. And these two ways would be deductive and inductive reasoning. So we're going to look at both of these, but really rather than just getting buried into the technicalities, I really would encourage you to first look at the examples. So we're going to start by talking about the deductive reasoning. And I'm going to work through it with you by using one example, and that allows us then to come up with the kind of formula of what deductive reasoning really tells us. So in deductive reasoning, we start with a general idea, and from there we make a conclusion that applies for a specific situation. So let's say that the general idea would be that all muscles are made of living tissues, and we know that all humans have muscles. So that allows us to draw a conclusion that all humans are made of living tissues. So it's a way of thinking where we take something general, a fact of life, and then we expand that to explain a specific situation. So really one way that deductive reasoning is described is as being top-down logic. So we could take another general fact. Let's take a general fact that night follows the day. That's our general idea. And then we can expand that to a specific situation. We can predict that after today, this specific day, there is going to be night. So again, we go from general to very specific. And that's an example of this top-down logic that's known as deductive reasoning. Let's compare that with inductive reasoning. I think that that's always easier when you have two things that you can compare. In inductive reasoning, unlike on deductive, we start with specific observation or observations. So it can be one or multiple observations. And based on those observations, we start drawing larger conclusions about life and our surroundings and where we live and how life happens. So let's start from the bottom, from specific observation. And the specific observation could be, for example, that my neighbor's cat hisses at me every day when I walk past. So that allows us to expand that specific observation to further. Well, when we go to a pet store, also cats there tend to hiss at me. And from these specific observations, we draw a broad conclusion. So our conclusion in this case could be that all cats probably hate me since they all are hissing at me. So this comes from one or multiple specific observations that help us to come up with a broad conclusion. And of course, in both deductive and inductive reasoning, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So both can be correct and both can be also flawed. But the inductive reasoning is really bottom-up logic. So we start with individual events, and those allow us to come up with the general rules about the world. Whereas if we compare it to the deductive reasoning, we took these general rules about the world and we used them to explain individual events that we saw. So I hope that that helps to make a little bit of sense of the difference between these two and difference between those two terms. And I think a good way of looking at it would be that let's test out what we just learned. If we have a statement that my neighbor's cat hisses at me daily, at the pet store, all the cats hiss at me, so therefore all the cats probably hate me, would you say that this is more of deductive or inductive reasoning? And again, if you don't mind, you can just shout out at the chat. I greatly would appreciate that. Perfect. I see answers coming in, and I'm very appreciative of that. And you are correct. It would be a good example of the inductive reasoning. Great job there. So clearly, I don't think that this concept threw you off too much. I'm very glad to hear that. The other aspect that I want to talk about sciences is that we can approach sciences in two different branches. We can consider that we look at quality. So we talk about qualitative sciences, or we can look at quantity, in which case we talk about quantitative sciences. And I know that they too sound very similar, and the best way really to approach them is to get to the big idea behind them. So let's compare qualitative and quantitative. So really, qualitative data and qualitative science is science where we collect data that is not numeric. So it's more of things like descriptions, words, pictures, observations, symbols about the world. So it's everything but numeric information about what's around us, what the world is made of. Whereas quantitative is all about numbers. So we can quantify, we can count, we can give numeric values to quantitative sciences and data that we acquire in quantitative methods. So that's the big difference. Remember that qualitative is something that is not numeric, whereas quantitative is always numeric. And that then defines how we can use that data and how good we consider that data being. And the word good is always dangerous because data is good for whatever it is meant for. So not all data is meant to be one kind. It can be meant to be either qualitative or quantitative. So what I did, I prepared this nice little comparison of some of the key points of similarities and differences between qualitative and quantitative sciences. And I know that it's small, but that's the reason why I have provided it to you on our Blackboard as a separate file that you can download and you can have a look of it in greater detail. And actually on this week's homework, you will be given this table. And then you are asked to work out things that whether it is an example of qualitative or quantitative data. And really, again, keep in your mind the big concept that qualitative was all about. It could not be presented in a numerical sense. And I don't know, I kind of messed up there with the highlighter. So that's what I'm clicking away, trying to wipe it off. So it is everything but numeric, whereas quantitative was all about numbers. We can measure an amount, the rate, the weight, the scale. something that can be expressed in numbers when we talk about quantitative data. In terms of what kind of research do we do with both? The type of research varies based on which method we use. Usually when we use qualitative research, it's early research. It's kind of exploring. So we describe that as being exploratory research. It's finding out how or why. These broad questions where we don't really have great hypotheses yet. Whereas quantitative research is often much more structured. We have already some sort of a theory, and we want to either find support or evidence against of that theory. We might want to be able to put some sort of a rank or assign things in different categories or assign values to things. So the nature of what kind of research one is and the other one is really largely different. And I think a good way of looking at those is to focus on those examples of what kind of data can we acquire with each method. So if we do qualitative research, we often end up with data that's made of words or descriptions or observations. It can be pictorial, it can be symbols, it can be objects. Whereas on quantitative data, often all about numbers, and those numbers allow us to then do statistics. They allow us to do tests and manipulate those numbers. So how would you collect data on each? The qualitative data is collected in a natural setting, whereas often the quantitative data is all about collecting it in a lab. And these are not definite, but that's the big kind of a difference between the two. And in terms of how the data is collected, the researcher is actively involved in the collection of the qualitative data. It can be observations, but it can also be interactions with the participants, such as interviews or doing focus groups, finding out about either researchers or subjects' personal experiences. It can be analyzing different kinds of records, documents, but really the researcher is in it, both in terms of the investment on that, but also on the process. Whereas on quantitative research, we really try to avoid the researchers' effect on the data collection or on the what kind of data we're getting and how the subject provides the data. So it's really all about measuring and doing numerical comparisons between different settings or conditions. So we're using a lot of experimental methods, and we are really trying to be good about controlling things that can affect the results. So we control the variables, but we also conduct this research in a very controlled setting in a lab. And we try to group answers into groups that have been predefined. So it doesn't really leave that much room for these creative things that can come up. It's fairly structured and it doesn't really lend itself for something unexpected. How do you analyze then data? Well, numbers are easy to analyze, I say, because I've spent a big part of my life doing statistics. So you can do with numbers all sorts of things. You can do descriptive things where you are describing what the numbers look, what the numbers tell us, but you can also do numerical testing. So you can compare different conditions, different groups, and so on. So numbers can be manipulated easily. Whereas if we're doing qualitative research, we end up having to do different kinds of analysis of the content, the themes, or discourse. So really unbundle, unpack that information and distract the information from that. There are strengths to both. The quantitative data is often considered as very objective. and it's really testing a hypothesis. We're thinking of something and we want to find out, do we find evidence in favor or against it? And often we do use large sets of sample sizes on the quantitative research, and it's really easy to repeat it. The qualitative research instead, it really is all about real life contexts. So we are studying things in their natural surroundings. We are not going to the lab, so you could say that it's much more realistic. We're much more in the real world there. And we are also realizing that the subjects have perspective on things. So there is this interaction between the research and the participant. Their interaction, they're working together, they're creating that data. And it's really good, these qualitative methods, for finding information that is kind of subtle, and they can be very complex issues, and the differences or the keys to what we're really trying to find out are not obviously standing out. So it's all about finding different kinds of relationships, causes, effects, dynamics. So it's much harder than numbers are easy to put into boxes and group and compare one number to another. Qualitative data requires a little bit more skills how to navigate with it. Well, because these are so different methods, if you think of this qualitative method, that is very time consuming and it's also costly. So as a result, we often end up doing very small data sets. And there are some concerns because the replication is so difficult that, well, is this now valid for every group, every situation? It is hard to make general statements from qualitative research. But we remember that that happened in the real life context. So then again, quantitative research often is very artificial. It's conducted often in a non-natural setting, and it is designed before the experiment. So it doesn't really allow chances to change things if we're finding out. And when we designed that, the researchers' assumptions of what could be the potential outcomes kind of limit the outcome of that. We give usually limited answering options, and really how good of a researcher, how well you know the topic field, does have an effect on how successful quantitative research is. And really quantitative research needs large numbers of data so that we can come up with results from that. And I have a bunch of quiz questions here, and these are really quick and easy to go through in terms of are they qualitative or are they quantitative? And the way I would like to go through this is that rather than we shout out answers to these, let's consider one researcher and her life's work, and then consider which one of these would better align on each case on her work. So I don't know, does anyone recognize the lady that we see on this picture? Or does the name Jane Goodall mean anything to anyone? And it's totally fine if it doesn't. And if you have even an idea, you can give a shout out. Does anyone know what kind of field she worked on? So she is an expert in the research of chimpanzees. So she's probably ape lady. Good job. You got it, Andrew. So she has been working since 60s with apes and done a great amount of research. And her research method was that, okay, you go to the wilderness where the chimpanzees live, and you stay around the chimpanzees long enough that they accept you to be part of their group. They don't get bothered of you being around. So she didn't even expect immediately to be able to come up with a lot of data. She realized that these chimpanzees will know that I'm here. So for that reason, I need to first develop a trust, and I need to develop a relationship with them. And only once they're cool with me being there, I can start observing them in their natural environment and find out how they behave, how they act. So, knowing all that, do you think that her research was more of numeric or non-numeric? And of course, you can always assign numeric values to anything, but do you think that at large you would say that she's a quantitative or qualitative researcher? Is she a numeric or non-numeric researcher? Perfect. Qualitative research, so non-numeric. You're absolutely right. So what she does, she's not really interested so much, or what she wasn't interested was having a number that this many apes did this. She's more of trying to find those more subtle dynamics within the group of monkeys. Good job. So as a reminder, qualitative research all about non-numeric information, whereas quantitative is all about numeric information. Then if we compare, would her research be more of exploratory, or would it be research where units of measurements are being used? Again, it's a kind of a tougher question, but you can remember that one applies to one and another applies to another. Perfect. It is exploratory. So we are exploring. We don't really know yet what we're going to find out in that research. So she went there with very open set of assumptions, what the outcome, what the results might be. So qualitative research is all about exploratory research. It's especially good for that. Whereas quantitative was all about that research with units of measurements. And really her work is not that quantitative, it's much more qualitative. Do you think that Jane conducted much of her research in a natural setting or lab setting based on what we just discussed? Well, I think even the picture gives us a very good clue where she might be. You are absolutely right. She's at the natural setting. So we have studied chimpanzees for a long time, but we have not done that great of a job, especially before 60s, of studying them in their own environment. We know that behavior changes significantly when you're not in your natural surroundings. So she was all about studying in a qualitative approach the chimpanzees in their natural setting. If we were to study something in a lab setting, that would be much more likely going to be quantitative research. Do we think that her research involved participating and interacting with the subjects? Or was her research more objective and trying to eliminate any personal interactions? And I really refer to that picture that we see there. Do we think that she's being very objective, very distant, or is she participating? You are absolutely correct. So she's all about interacting. So she acknowledged that the apes, the chimpanzees, will notice that she is there. So for that reason, she will need to interact with them. And really looking how they communicate, trying to find ways to communicate with them was one of the big contributions that Jane has brought for the field of studying apes. So her qualitative research was all about interacting with the subjects, being very participating very largely on that research. Whereas again, the quantitative research would be much more objective, trying to eliminate any personal interactions and be as objective as we could be. So again, the next two, we can associate that understanding deeper level undertones of the subject's answers is a good example of qualitative research, whereas quantitative research is really focusing on this objectivity, having unbiased information that's backed up with statistics. So when we look at Jane's work, it's all about trying to find these more subtle undertones. So she definitely, all of our examples so far confirm is a qualitative researcher. And if we look at the instance in statistics for a sample size, how many subjects are we studying for? And if we look at Jane, it took time to build those relationships with the group of chimpanzees, but also with individual chimpanzees. So there was a limit to how many chimpanzees she could study at one time. So the sample sizes for her work were also very small. So qualitative research often relies on small sample sizes, whereas quantitative research in general often relies on large sample sizes. This is not as cut and dry. I have done a lot of quantitative research in medicine where sample sizes can be small. And that's because we're not really allowed to make people sick. And only so many people get sick. So we can't really try to get big sample sizes on purpose. So it's not as definite. But at large, in general, quantitative research focuses on large sample sizes. And we talked earlier on about this, how we analyze the data. In qualitative research, such as what Jane does, it's all about analyzing the content, themes, discourses that come up from that data. Whereas qualitative research is this finding different kinds of means, averages, standard deviations, testing the numbers. You can graph the findings to illustrate them. The reason why I picked Jane is that she's a friend of a good friend of mine. So I have great respect for the work that she's done and being a pioneer at the time when it must have been harder to be a young female researcher on this field. And she took something that no one was doing and went for it. Kind of to wrap up, we saw that her research would be very subjective, individual perspective, whereas the quantitative research, we make a hypothesis, we assume something, and then we want to find out, does the hypothesis hold over time? So that's the difference between those two. Kind of the couple of last ones that I want to highlight there. It is harder or sometimes impossible to replicate the research setting in a qualitative research. Jane's relationship with those chimpanzees is unique. My relationship will never be the same. But then again, your relationship with those chimpanzees would be unique, and my relationship would never be the same as yours. So it is hard or impossible to replicate those research settings in a qualitative research. Whereas on quantitative, we are really big on that anyone can take our research and repeat it and get the same results. And also how we ask questions varies. So in qualitative research, these questions are very vague, very open for whoever is answering to those questions or whatever information we're trying to find to take shape based on what we end up finding. Whereas quantitative research, we really have predetermined answer options. They are very specific, closed questions that we use on those. Well, this is a good question for you to try to make up your mind. Would this be an example of qualitative, so descriptive research, or would this be an example of quantitative, So numeric research. If I go and measure the heart rate from 100 people and then come to a conclusion that average heart rate is 60 beats per minute, would that be an example of qualitative or quantitative research? What say you? And I see you guys have got this perfectly. You totally got this. So that would be an example of quantitative numeric research because we have a numeric outcome for that. And it's really easy to repeat. So my field, I shared with you last week that I've done a lot of work on cardiac magnetic resonance imaging and finding the different properties that tissues have in the magnetic fields, and that's what I focused on. So I'm definitely a quantitative researcher. Oh, I jumped to the wrong place. I'm definitely all about doing quantitative research, but it doesn't mean that qualitative research wouldn't be as good. It's just for a different use than what I use my research for. So both have a place and both are important and both bring in a lot to the field of making science, coming up with knowledge. And because I want to be respectful of your time, I'm going to move on. But if you do have questions, feel free to shout out. Feel free to enter those to the chat. The last topic that I really want to talk at large is to do with the scientific method. And this is the method that I referred earlier on our class today, which was this kind of structured way in a systematic approach to find answers and come up with knowledge. And the picture that we have there is from Sir Francis Bacon from 1600s, who was the first one, as far as we know, to define the scientific method. And depending on who you ask and how this has been mapped out, there's different number of steps in scientific method. But scientific method really always aims to either support or not support the hypothesis. So we want to find evidence. Is our assumption supported by our experiment or is it not supported? So let's look at those different steps. And the way I want to approach this is that our research question that I give to you is that, is there a right way to eat a banana? So we start our scientific method, scientific process by having previous knowledge about the topic. We know that most humans eat a banana in a certain way, but we've also been to the wilderness and we've observed that apes don't seem to do the same thing as we do. They actually open their banana from the other end. So we want to find out, is there a better way to eat a banana? Is one way better than another? So that's going to be our question. And based on our question, we can formulate a hypothesis. So hypothesis is kind of a preliminary explanation. Often it includes if and then. So we can say, for example, as a hypothesis, if you open the banana from the end that apes often do, it's going to be quicker to open it. So it is some sort of an explanation for the question. We don't know it for sure, but we speculate that that might be the case. Well, then that gives us a prediction that opening the banana from the end that apes open it, unlike what most humans open it, is going to be quicker. So that's our prediction. And we can go and conduct an experiment. Say I give you 100 bananas and I measure how long it takes you to open it from one end. Then I give you another 100 bananas and I ask you to open them from another end. And I measure how quickly you can do that. Of course, there's going to be an element of practice that speeds up, but we can instead do this on a large number of people and with lesser of bananas. Or we can have apes and humans opening those. So comparing those two groups. This process gives us some sort of data. So this data, if it's a quantitative research, it's going to be numeric data, but it can be qualitative research. It can be words, it can be descriptions, it can be observations. So both kinds of data are valuable data. Well, from the data, we can draw results. So data section in a scientific report only tells us the numbers, and the results summarize those numbers. We don't give meanings to those numbers yet. So the results are just presenting the findings, the numbers, but we're not explaining why we are seeing those numbers. It is within the conclusion section where we start to give meanings that, well, because we saw that you were quicker to open the bananas from that end, it must be more efficient. So that's what goes to the conclusion part of the scientific method. So as a result, we either find support for the hypothesis, or then we find that hypothesis is not supported. If the hypothesis is not supported, we go back to the hypothesis and redefine it and repeat the entire process, and this time see if we find support for our hypothesis. If hypothesis is supported, there is something important that we gotta do. We gotta publish our findings. We gotta share those findings. Just that you know this is not enough. We want the world to know about your work, and that can then help others. And if we have multiple research pieces pointing to same things, that gives us enough support that we can start formulating a theory about the world and how life works. So here I have a couple of questions. We're not going to cover everything, but real quickly, if we have the step where we are formulating tentative explanations, what would we call that? There's another term for it than just having preliminary explanations. During the third step of the scientific process, that starts with H. What would be that? We are formulating hypotheses. Good job, Donovan. So hypothesis is this tentative explanation of what we are assuming that we might end up finding. Well, when following the scientific methods, this results section of the laboratory report is formed. That includes the numerical summary. But does that also include the analysis of the findings, considerations for the reasons, and reasons why these findings were found? Does that go, the explanations, also to the result area of the report? We just touched upon that. I didn't dwell on it. But would that be true or false? You are correct. That would be false. Good job, Donovan. So it would be false. Those reasons and analysis of why this might be, that would be all discussion section. The process of scientific method starts with observations and previous knowledge about the topic, and these help us to generate a research question. Do we think that that's true, or is that false? And I know that these are a little rapid fires. You're correct. It is true. So we definitely need to have some sort of previous knowledge. We need to do some observation before we run a study. And I was going to share with you a couple of examples of oopsies when things have gone a little unexpectedly in scientific method. I know that we're pushing on the time, so I'm going to jump into it real fast. So one of the medical interests that affects a lot of people is issues with blood pressure. And pharmaceutical industry has been looking on developing various medications for managing the blood pressure for quite a while. And they use the scientific method on the process of drug development. I used to be employed by a pharmaceutical company, so I've seen this in very, very close practice. What we do to manage the blood pressure, we can come up with a medicine, and once we have this medicine that we think that works and we do lab experiments, we have to give it to humans and try it out. And turns out that we always give the drugs first to a group of healthy males. It doesn't matter even if it's a drug that's planned for a condition of some kind, we want to give it to healthy folks first, so we see the reaction in them. And we always give it to males. Does anyone have idea why we would give drugs first to males when we're testing them out, rather than giving it to females? Is it just because males are kind of easier to replace? That was a joke, so please don't get me into trouble for that. Any guesses why we would go with males first? Well, the secret lies in the hormones and the hormonal changes that females go throughout the menstrual cycle. So we first try out on males, and once we have done that, we can extend then that research to females and larger numbers. It's just harder to map on females what is a result of the monthly cycle and what is a result of the drug. So with males, it's a little easier in the early phases of research. Well, we did that study on a group of people for a blood pressure medication. And one thing that we always do, we collect information of side effects. And they all kept coming back, the males, saying that, yes, it worked, but something else happened as well when I took that medicine. And what happened is that blood flow to a certain part of their body was affected. Well, pharmaceutical companies said that, you know what, this sounds like we could make more money by selling this drug for erection problems than by selling it as a blood pressure medication. And they rebranded, repackaged the drug, and that's how Viagra came about. So there is in science two types of science. Sometimes we are looking just for pure facts about things. This is basic science, but applied science looks for real world uses for the research that we do. And what we saw there was definitely a real world use. The same method is how we found out penicillin as well. There was an accident in the lab, and that allowed us to come up with penicillin. I mentioned that it's important to share your findings. I have done research back in my day quite a bit, and I have been lucky to share in peer-reviewed journals a lot of our research. That process is very multi-stepped and very carefully controlled. That your research, you can't just write what you think, it actually has to be backed up by evidence. What I was going to discuss with you last was what makes something living, but I know that we've reached our time, so you will be able to watch this from our lecture videos for this chapter, that what classifies something as being alive. And I've listed 9 different points. So I'm going to go through these still real fast here. But if you have to move on to other things, I completely understand. And there is already lecture videos available on our Blackboard. But you can also check out the rest of this session through a recording. So really fastly, life is ordered. So life is not just random. If we look at a living thing, there's some sort of an order. Eye is where the eye is supposed to be. Arms, limbs are where the limbs are supposed to be. The order is also seen on microscopic scale. The cells are packed in an order that represents the best for the functionality. For example, in terms of skin layers, a layer that's new cells that are dividing, and the outermost layers are actually dead cells of your skin. Living things are also able to respond to environment. We see here mimosa plant that when you touch it, its leaves react to that. We can have many microorganisms that are able to respond as well to environment where they're at. Plants tend to lean towards the source of the light. open their flowers for the day, close for the night. Living things are also able to reproduce. The reproduction strategy can vary. So there is sexual reproduction where there's a male and female or male and female equivalent, and as a result of mixture of their genetic material comes a new offspring. Or it can be asexual, such as a plant growing a bud that then just breaks off, like a genetic copy, identical copy of the parent. So that's really a tough question. Which one came first, sexual or asexual reproduction? Living things are also able to adapt to their environment. So if environment changes, the living things can over time adapt to that changing environment. Also, living things have to be able to grow. And during the growth, we are also able to develop to be better adjusted. Living things are capable of regulating themselves and their processes. And living things also show something that's known as homeostasis. And homeostasis is an important concept, so I'm going to go through it, although we're pushing for the time. So in homeostasis, we have some kind of a stimulus, something that happens, a change from normal, and that's then sensed by sensory organs. The sensory organs pass a message to the control center, which in our case of humans is often our brain. And within the control center, we have a set point. That's the range of acceptable values for this stimulus. And if the stimulus is off from the set point, what we consider as range of acceptable values, an effector kicks in. Effector's job is typically to stop the stimulus from happening. And this is known as negative feedback. A good example of this would be, for example, thermoregulation, so regulation of our body temperature. Our body temperature is typically maintained within a narrow range. If our body temperature starts to raise too high, we sense that. The information gets passed to the brain, and if it is higher than what it should be, we can, for example, start sweating to get rid of some of the heat. We can want to get an urge to move to a cooler place, and so on and so on. So all these actions are negative. They try to stop the stimulus from happening. And that is the case in most processes in the world. Occasionally, we can also have positive feedback, which makes the stimulus happen even more. I only can think of 3 examples. These would be childbirth, so uterine contractions during the giving birth, clotting of the blood, and I also can think of milk production or lactation when the baby suckles the nipple. All of those stimulate more of that response. But those are the only 3 examples of positive feedback that I can think of. So it's really much more often negative feedback. So homeostasis is all about maintaining consistent internal environment, and living things are capable of doing that. Living things also use and process energy and are able to evolve over multiple generations to better adjust to their environment. So those are things that make something living. And that's really where I'm going to stop today. Final thing that you can have a look is that things are ordered. There is an order of levels of life. We can look at life on an atom level, cell level, tissue level, organ level, organism level, such as human, or we can go even bigger and look at populations, communities, ecosystems, or entire Earth. But like I said, there's more information about that also on the actual lecture videos that are available. And that concludes all I had planned to share today. Anything that you feel that you want to ask, or anything that was unclear? We've gone through some of the questions from the quiz. We've gone through the key points of the lecture material. What we're going to do next time, we're going to move on to talk about the lab. But as always, if you have questions, I'm so happy to answer to those. If you don't have questions, I really thank you for having joined me today. It's been a busy night, I know that, but we managed to cover quite a bit. And this is really the fundamental basis that we're going to be building on this course. So I thank you for having joined me. And I wish you very good rest of the night. If you have questions, I'll be here around. Otherwise, have a good night. Thank you. Thank you for sticking around. I realized that I took a little more of your time. Good night. For the lab one, will the book help us to complete it? Really, you won't need the textbook to complete the lab one. So basically what you're going to be doing, you're just going to be analyzing what you see. We're going to be working through the lab one together on our Wednesday session. So if you are feeling a little confused about it, Wednesday might help you, but you don't really need the textbook for that. And remember that you can have multiple attempts on that as well. I hope that that helps. Have a good night. Thank you, Donovan. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Do not stress. It's not going to be a tricky lab. Well, I'm going to stop recording at this point, and I'm going to just take a couple of notes that help me to take the attendance. And I thank you for having joined me.